He's going to talk about Cocoapods. He's very special because he has been called the Lady Gaga of iOS development. So please, everybody, give a warm hand for Orta.
Okay, so before we even get started, little technical thing. I'm going to hook myself up to this computer and hope that magic just works. Oh, look at that. How good is that? Okay. So, I would like to talk to you guys about the future of Cocoapods. And to get started with that, I wanted to give you guys at least a little bit of a brief over what Cocoapods is, so that we all are speaking on the same vocabulary. So, first up, I'd like to know, who actually uses Cocoapods? Okay, so I think that means I can go pretty fast through this bit. All right, so Cocoapods is an application-level dependency manager. What that really means is we take in all your dependencies and we integrate it into your application. But it's also a community around open source code. You could very easily have a dependency manager that doesn't do things like making sure that it's got a great website and ways of actually accessing and publishing and really trying to get the community coming back to itself. And Cocoapods does this a lot different to things like NPM or Bundler. These are tools that you don't really have these tools running conferences. You don't really have these tools having the developers that come out and talk to as many people as possible. And to be honest, it's done a huge amount of good stuff to the Objective-C community. And yes, right? And so the way that it works is very simple. We use a dependency manager to download our dependency manager. Developers provide a recipe for creating Xcode projects, and we call these pod specs. And then the actual users of Cocoapods create a list, a recipe of these different pod specs, and that allows you then for us to deal with the hard work, which is like integrating into Xcode, downloading the different versions, and making sure that every single person has the exact same version of the same code. So, to give you a good example before we get started, this is one of the pod files from one of my apps. I'm pretty sure it's now about 100 lines long. I use a large amount of Cocoapods myself. All of these are open source projects. Internally, where I work, anytime we feel like something needs to can be very simply modularized, we just turn it into an open source project and throw it out there. So that means that we can receive a lot of contributions back, and we can make maintenance a lot easier when it's a very small team. So then, intro to Cocoapods done. Intro to myself. My name is Orta Therox. I'm the design dictator of Cocoapods. That means I came in and I said, the way that Cocoapods is right now, we could do a lot more community outreach. We could do a lot more on in terms of actual cool design in the ecosystem around Cocoapods itself. So that was where I kind of came in. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But what I'm going to talk about now is basically what are we doing at this point in time. Some people will know that one of the core dev team at Cocoapods has recently been given 3 months worth of full-time employment working specifically on Cocoapods, which blows my mind that now he's done some really cool contributions for the past year and a half, and now he actually gets to work full-time on this system. And here he is giving a great thumbs up. I love this guy. And so he's done some really cool stuff. He's been doing it now for a month, and one of the big things that he's been thinking about is how do we make the actual pod file itself, so not the spec, actually when you're doing it yourself, how do we make that more specific? There's a lot of vaguity in the actual pod file itself, usually because we wanted to make it as simple as possible up front, but we will be doing breaking changes in the pod file, which will probably affect the vast majority of people, to kind of make the actual pod file a lot more specific. And this is usually in the cases when you've got multiple targets or multiple Xcode projects, and you're trying to, it's a bit vague whether the specific pod will actually hook up to something. So he's been working on that right now. He's also been working on something that appeared 2 days ago, which is called Cocoapods Edit. And this is a Cocoapods plugin that will essentially allow you to just say, pod edit the pod that you would like to work on, and it will switch it basically into a version that you can sort of edit in runtime and just commit those changes back up to your actual main master server, wherever that is. It's one of those things that a lot of people are trying to figure out what is the right flow for when you've got a large amount of pods. So like the example we had earlier with Zing, where they've got a very large amount of internal pods, but then they have to have them all as paths that are all at head, and they all have, they make it very hard for you to instantly hot swap the version that you're working on versus the version that someone else has worked on and you're pulling down. And pod edit is going to be one of these ways in which we can make that a lot simpler for everybody. One of the cool things about this structure is that we can have private gems that plug into CocoaPods that mean that a lot of the work that we do doesn't have to specifically be done on the CocoaPods actual gem itself. So sometimes it can be quite a while between actual updates because we don't need to do a release in order to get new features out to people. I'll show some good examples of when we've done this in a bit. In fact, I'll show some examples very soon. We've been working with a CocoaPods plugin system. It's a lot like Alcatraz, but for CocoaPods. And what we've done recently is we've made essentially a singular definitive JSON file on one of our repos that is the equivalent of every single CocoaPods plugin, a description, who did it, and a little bit of information around this. And you'll see with the next version that we're coming out with, one of the pod plugins is actually a pod plugin, which tells you about pod plugins. And it would be a really nice, simple way to show it off. And I think it's coming up soon. I'll explain it a bit further then. But one of the ones that we've been working on and has been in now for maybe 3 months, I think, is pod try. And pod try was our first official attempt at trying to turn CocoaPods into a collection of smaller, individual, modular gems, which mean that people can just jump in and actually work with the ecosystem around CocoaPods without having to actually go in and contribute to some of our larger repos that have a lot of linting, and we're very cautious about making sure that you write your tests. And it gives people a chance to play with this. And for an example, like I contribute to CocoaPods try quite regularly because I use it a lot. It's this really cool plugin that effectively comes with CocoaPods now, so you'd never know if you were just a normal user that you could do pod space try space a pod name, and it will go and clone it into your temp folder. If it needs to do pod install, it will go and do a pod install, and it will automatically run it up in Xcode for you. It's a really cool tool for trying out a pod. A really cool one came out today that was like for doing CA layer meshes, so you could like deform views. And I just typed in pod try, the name of that pod, and like within a few seconds I could actually dig through the code, run the example. Really cool thing. But when we initially released it, Fabio, who I mentioned earlier, kind of disappeared off the net for a few months. And then we didn't have the ability, because he was the only person with access to pod try, to update it in CocoaPods. So what we ended up doing was, because it was a plugin, we could actually have our own version of it that we would update, separate from him initially, that people didn't have to update CocoaPods in order to update pod try. They could just update pod try, and they'd get all the bug fixes that we'd been working on. So pod plugin has been really cool. And as I said, there's this really cool one, which is CocoaPods plugin. It's one of the ways in which it'll be very easy for people to list and see, and because it's going to be because it is a generic JSON file on one of our websites, that basically means that anybody else has the same access to it as we do, and they'll be able to make whatever you're really interested in making. Right now, this is the simplest we could think of, but this wasn't even created by a core contributor. This was created by a friend of mine who was doing a bug bash. It's like a hackathon we did a few weeks ago that persuaded people to come and start trying to hack on CocoaPods and to fix some of our issues and to do some serious triaging. And so we'll be moving this into the main Cocoapods in the next version, but it's meant that he's had a contribution that's been very atomic. He's had a lot of control over how it's worked, and we've come in towards the end to ensure there's a level of consistency within the Cocoapods ecosystem, because if we're going to import it in, we have to make sure everything's solid, but plugins have been fun for this reason. And this is a really cool one. I don't think it'll ever be included as a default, but you can actually ask a pod, when you're creating your library, for an example, it's sometimes interesting to see how well documented it is. And so what this will do is it will use the Cocoapods infrastructure. It's called Cocoapods-docstats, and it will run it through the tool AppleDoc, and it will automatically tell you as a percentage how much your document, how much of your pod file has been documented. I really liked this idea when it came out. And then finally, there's been some of the things that we don't even want to fix ourselves. So we always use Git, but there's a lot of people that don't. And for personal or private repos of specs, then sometimes it makes sense to actually use things like Subversion or HG. And so we have people that actually have their own plugins that just add extra functionality that only they need, so that they don't have to have their own forks, for an example, that adds support for Subversion, whilst we say no. I'm really happy with that. We've been looking at the feed. This has always existed, but we've never tried to publicize it as a place where you can actually go and look and stuff. So many people should be familiar with the Cocoapods feed on Twitter. It's a Twitter feed where every time we get a new pod, we post the name, the social media URL for someone, the description about the pod, so that you can see what's new in the ecosystem. And as we usually end up with 10 or so a day, then it's not spamming your Twitter feed entirely, but it's enough that you can still feel like you're keeping on top of the entire environment. It's also really cool because it reminds me of how many pods we have. So we're almost hitting 5,000. So it's nice to watch this grow. I'm pretty sure maybe only 2 or 3 months ago we were at 4,000. So that's been one of the big things we've been working on. And then as part of the hackathon that I mentioned earlier, the Bug Bash, we ended up coming up with this cool tool called the Rainforest. So Cocoapods is a collection of gems, as I mentioned. And gems is like the Ruby equivalent of Cocoapods, I guess. And it's very hard to initially get set up because there's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of ways in which you have to, if you want to do one feature, you may have to do it in multiple parts of the different gems. And so what we have is this singular repo that you go in. It has a collection of rake tasks that will automatically generate almost the entire Cocoapods development environment for you. So say, for example, that you've got a really critical fix that's been at least fixed in master, but it's not been pushed yet. And it doesn't look like we'll be pushing it anytime soon. It's basically only 2 lines of code for you to clone this repo, run the rake task to get set up, and then have it running Cocoapods as like the developer version, like running on head instead of always running from the local cache of Ruby stuff. So Rainforest has been awesome, and I'm super excited that still gets worked on. This is how I work on Cocoapods. I go into the Rainforest, make some changes, and submit them back. It's very simple, very easy. And if you're interested in getting started, this is exactly where I'd recommend looking. So enough about what we're doing, more about what we're about to do. And to get started on that, I wanted to talk about probably the only Objective-C project that we have. And this has come out of a bit of frustration about figuring out how to give acknowledgements to other people and people that you've depended on in order to make your application. So we started out, me and Fabio, of a project creating this thing called Cpd Acknowledgements. And it relies on a Cocoapods plugin that's not out yet, but effectively what it does is every single pod spec effectively gets put into your project, and then we can introspect that. And so this is a collection of view controllers for showing smart defaults about how you can give attribution to the libraries that you've used and the people that have worked on the projects. It allows you to email authors or give contributions back to to your developers, like your designers. And it's a really cool project. This is just on one of our public repos, and anybody can go in and make contributions to it. I haven't touched it in a few months, I think, because there's something else that I've been working on. But this is really nice, easy one if you want to contribute back to the Cocoapods environment, but not have to learn an entirely new development environment. The next thing is something that we've been talking about for maybe 8 months, maybe even a year, and we call it Trunk. And it's like the authentication server for Cocoapods. So this is the way of saying you can't edit Matt Thompson's pod specs. So he's the only person who can edit AF networking. It provides a large amount of security for individuals, and it's how nearly every other dependency manager does it. As part of the process, that means we also get to kick off the ability for people to run arbitrary Ruby code on your computer, which is another big advantage because that's just a security issue just waiting to happen. Some of the advantages of that is that because there's authentication systems, we don't have to accept pull requests anymore. We can just say, check it. If it checks out fine on your computer, and if it checks out fine on our servers, then it's probably fine. And whatever you do at that point, you can probably not break everybody's installs of Cocoapods, because that's what we did February this year. Woo! But one of the cool things about having a centralized server is also that we can do webhooks. And webhooks are a brilliant way that we can expose new Cocoapods to everybody. So, for example, there's at least 2 or 3 websites that exist only to provide a separate search interface to Cocoapods, which is really cool because that gives us the chance to see what other people are doing with the same data set. But it's hard for them because they have to keep parsing it. They have to, constantly poll. But ideally, with this, we'll be able to have Cocoapods webhooks. And considering how many of the actual web properties that we build rely on having a webhook from the specs repo, it means that we can all dog food them entirely. And you'll start seeing a really solid API that everybody can build cool tools based around new and fresh Cocoapods and having a really up-to-date database. And so I just wanted to show you what some of these look like. It might be a bit hard to read, but this is what a normal Cocopod looks like. And that's just a collection of Ruby code. Anybody that's done a pod spec will know exactly what it looks like. Simple, straightforward. But ideally, what you'll be seeing from the future is the equivalent, but in a JSON file. And we do this with some kind of cool code, which just basically passes it into an object, passes it into JSON. It's not too hard. We've had support in the app for maybe 6 months now. And it's been one of those projects that that's just kept on going and going, because it's very hard to get authentication right. But one of the cool things that will do, as I said, is give you pod push. You'll just be able to type pod push from your actual library, and that will send it up to the server, and that will be it. It'll get linted locally. It'll get linted with the rest of the Cocoapods in general. This is just to make sure you can't make breaking changes on, say, changing the source URL. So suddenly it goes to somewhere else instead of what it has been for a bunch of other pods, usually for security. And the idea of just being able to just push it out will, for me, make it a lot easier to just have small updates. Because if you have to go through the pull request cycle every time you want to make a change, it's not that much fun overall. And to pull this off, because there's no authentication now, we have to then start thinking, well, how do we add authentication to a system that previously has had free-for-all for 3 years? And the solution to that has been claiming your pod. So pretty soon, you're going to be able to go to this web page and say, these are the pods that I own. And if there's a dispute because 2 people want to claim over a name, then we'll arbitrate it as the Cocoapods team. And it's usually probably something very simple. And you can have multiple authors on the same pod. It'll be all nice and elegant and simple. And I'd always thought that this would take a while because we have a lot of milestone. We have a big milestone, and it's still going. I've only got 2 of them assigned to me at this point. But when I asked in the chat room today to kind of give you guys a sense of scale and how long this will take, I was surprised to find that it was actually guessing that it might just be tomorrow. So, so I'd originally prepared like a slide that was like, yeah, sometime in the next month or 2. So instead, it will be a nice, this is open source, so we don't have to do like hard deadlines. But in an ideal world, it will be out this week, or maybe next week. And that will mean that suddenly we'll be effectively cleaning up the specs repo. So I don't know if you've ever tried to load it up on GitHub, and it's just like churned forever in your browser because there's so many folders in there. But we'll be able to switch it all to JSON, move all those things into a little folder so that like it's actually usable to go in there and look around again. And this could happen anytime now. So I'm super excited about Trunk. I think that's going to be a massive change to the Cocoapods community, and I think it's going to be amazing to see authentication. And then, I guess, finally, I wanted to talk about something that I've been working on for a few months now. And when I started contributing to Cocoapods, I was originally just helping out on the Cocoapods specs repo, and that was making sure people understood how to actually get their contributions out, how to do small fixes, and it's a lot of repetitive work. Like nowadays we get somewhere between 50 to 60 pull requests a day, I think. I have 2 people that are spending a large amount of time only dealing with like helping people merge their pull requests, making sure that they're all green so that they don't break for everyone. And I did that initially, but then I moved into realizing that there was a larger problem with the community, and for me that was that documentation wasn't taken seriously. And when you did it in Ruby, you knew that every single piece of code that you published had a website associated with it that your name was attached to on Google. And so I came up with something called Cocodocs. And Cocodocs is a small little VPS Mac in the cloud somewhere, just generating tens of thousands of doc sets for every single library, and every time a new one comes out, it does a new one. Every time a new one changes, it generates a new one. And it's a really cool system. But it looks ugly to me. It doesn't work with my aesthetic. And the problem was I had to keep it consistent with the Cocoapods brand at the time, which is why I ended up working on an entirely new brand for Cocoapods. It's a long way around to getting to what I wanted to do. And I think it took about a year to get it to this point from when we started making the initial designs. And they're nice. Like, you can do a lot with it, but it doesn't have that nice feel. And what I found when I started looking at the analytics recently was, in terms of how much traffic the actual Cocoapods web properties get, Cocodocs is now starting to overtake the guides. Like, no one visits the blog, obviously, but and Cocoapods.org gets a lot of traffic, but Cocodocs needs a bit of love. And I'd like to show you that. I've been working on this now for 3 months for an effective redesign about how it should feel and interact. Let me just switch to double. Perfect, cool. So I have 13 tweet notifications, and I have Cocodocs version 2, which has like the equivalent of going back to Cocodocs, but with the new style of how Cocoapods itself has been since then. It's awesome. There's loads of cool features now that previously I'd have spent far too long trying to build. My favorites are actually here on the top. So we automatically tell you how well documented every single library is. So it makes it very easy for you to feel very guilty that you're only 30% documented. And then everybody knows that because it's there on the front page. We give you like the useful information. Like for those that are at the back, there's a big documentation thing in the center, and then next to that is the license. And a lot of people are very interested in what license the code is. And so what we do with Cocodocs now is we start looking actually internally at what the license is, and offer not just the license text, but we actually take you through to the website for the actual license at the OSI. So instead of just seeing Wi-Fi, conference Wi-Fi, instead of just seeing the actual license name, you actually get the context. And it then fits in where it fits in and you can get all the explanation. So like that even includes the do what the fuck you want license, which I don't particularly agree with, but I still love the idea that people can do it. It's taken into account a few other cool things as well. So those of you who are using continuous integration will usually have a little image like this one has in the center, which says build passing. This is the usual way that you can go and look at a library and see whether, A, if it's unit tested, and B, if they pass their tests. And one of the interesting things here is, by default, everybody includes the build passing as master. But when you're looking at things like this, you're going to want to actually see when it passed at the tag. So now Cocodocs actually goes, looks through the readmes, tries to see if it can find any links to Travis, and then makes sure all of those are actually relative to the actual version of the documentation you're looking at there and then. It's one of those subtle little cues that, by default, the actual normal way of dealing with this would not be as good as the user interaction as you'd like. Some of the other cool things that I've been looking at is, say, for example, there's this a new refined kind of drop-down that allows you to easily add to Dash or easily add things to Xcode. It also provides a bunch of other options that most of the time you end up wanting to do. When I was trying to figure out what the metaphor here was for what the drop-down should show, that was the idea of, imagine you had a Cocodocs object on your computer, and if you right-clicked on it, what were the kind of actions that you'd wanted to do? And so I just called this the right-click action menu. We also show the versions, so you can just scroll down and see every single past version. It's the same in the old one. But one of the cool things that it does is that when you start going into some of the other classes, the design changes. Because by default, it's nice to have this big, bold header and a lot of index. The index can have a lot of priority, because it's usually a very good overview of the actual project. Ooh, it's getting there. But instead, now, it's a lot more refined. It doesn't it tries to get out of the way of the actual documentation. One day you'll get to see it, but if not, I can just use one of my local copies, because I took this into account too. Oh yeah, there we go. Yeah, so see, what instead it does now is it's just a sleek bar on the top, and if you still wanted to actually see some of that information, if you mouse over it, just comes down along the bottom, and you can still go and see that, oh yeah, it's Matt Thompson that makes AF Networking. If I'm interested, I can go and follow him on Twitter at AF Networking, and you can still see the MIT. So that's really cool. I mean, there's a large amount of work on this, and right now there's only a few that I've actually published. Let's see, let's go back to Keynote, and I can give you a list. See, I don't even know what I'm doing. Where is it? Is it minimized, do you think? Yes, okay. Switch it back to this, and play on. Perfect. Okay, so right now there's only 3 available. I'll probably add the webhook by the end of the weekend, because GitHub has made some changes to the webhooks API that I hadn't anticipated. But it means that you can actually go and take a look at what these are doing. I went and checked the stats. These are the 3 most popular libraries according to Cocodocs Analytics. The actual AF networking accounts for maybe 60% of all traffic to, yeah, seriously, to Cocodocs. And I think there was 160,000 page views this month, which therefore means a lot of people are interested in what AF networking is doing. So I'd recommend going and taking a look at these and having a playing around. But that's not the best bit for library authors, in my opinion. I love the feel of how Cocodocs is now, but to some extent, I also love the idea that I might actually get the chance to manipulate this. So what we've done is add a .cocodocs file that you can add to your own library that you can then use to start customizing the actual library stylings itself. So this gives you the chance, say, if you're Peter with PSPDF kit, where they've got these bright blue branding. Like you could fit in beautifully with your own style instead of having like Cocodocs orange there all over the shop. And so to do this, I have an example. One of my projects now does this. But I can show you the example here. It's like this is AF networking. So I went and took AF networks colors and I applied it to the Cocodocs, and all you have to do is two lines of code that get included in your actual library, and then it will just always do this, and it will give you have the options to change things like the background, all the foreground colors, highlight colors. Because every single image asset in there is actually a SVG, that means that any color changes that you make on your own library will be propagated throughout Cocodocs entirely. So like the background color of the Cocodocs logo will change to make sure it fits in with how you want it to feel. Really happy with how that's gone on. And finally, one of the cool things also that we've done is we've taken into account how people use Cocodocs. There's like Dash, for example. Dash now supports Cocodocs really well, so you can go in and search for any version, anytime, and it will tell you exactly what you can get. But now instead, so in the previous versions of Cocodocs, it would just show you the normal default example, but in this case now, there's a refined, smaller version of Cocodocs specifically for how you would actually use Cocodocs in Dash and in Xcode. So they have their own specific design for there too. So there's been a lot of like attention to detail and how people really use documentation. So yeah, that's Cocodocs 2. It's hopefully coming out soon. I'll start migrating things over the next few weeks, but eventually, I think probably around WWDC time, I'm going to make the big switch that converts every single doc set to like Cocodocs 2 instead of the old one to keep everyone up to date. So I'm super pumped about that. And finally, there's 2 Cocoapods events coming up in WWDC. Oh, and there's the third, actually. We're doing labs at Alt Labs. So if you are going to be in San Francisco for the time, the week before, there's a Ruby Motion conference, and we're doing Cocoa with them, which is like a collection of small lightning talks. And then there's a Cocopod State of the Union talk, which gets all of the core devs, well, most of the core devs to come and do a talk about what they've been doing. Really cool. And then the Alt Labs, which we'll be doing something cool for that too. So if you have questions, thank you. Whew.